President Wong, Professor Yi, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, I am very grateful to be part of this conversation. I have very much enjoyed this presentation or this conference so far. I'm especially grateful to follow my dear friend Zhizhong Wang, who I have known for many years. I thought his presentation was excellent and extremely interesting. I hope that my presentation is equally interesting and will follow along in the quality of what we've already seen and heard. I have been especially interested in the attention paid to the gaps in international law, and as you will see, that is somewhat of the same approach I have taken to my presentation. I am also going to share some slides, and I hope that they are useful as supporting my discussion. These are the points that I would like to highlight as I go through my presentation. And I will cover these in order. Let me first start by saying from a NATO perspective, and of course I will say I do not speak on behalf of NATO. I don't currently work for NATO, so please don't take me as an official speaker on behalf of NATO. I am simply relaying to you what I believe NATO's positions are from their public statements. First of all, the NATO as an organization and all of its individual countries have made statements to the effect that they believe that international law, including the law of armed conflict, applies to cyber operations, both in peacetime and in armed conflict. That has been a matter of debate in the GGE meetings that Zhizhong Wang mentioned to us, and I think now the GGE has successfully concluded that that is true. But this has been a position that both NATO, excuse me, and its member nations has taken for some time. Now, the fact that international law applies does not mean all of the nations within NATO agree exactly how international law applies. And again, this is a moment where I will try and highlight some gaps. Generally, as this NATO manual says, NATO has adopted a view of a kind of a strict view of sovereignty and its application to cyber operations. And I'll give you a chance to read that. COs means cyber operations. I will just note that at least the UK disagrees with this point, and both statements from two successive attorney generals have drawn attention to the fact that the UK does not believe that sovereignty is its own principle of or its own rule of international law, but rather that it is a principle of international law that supports other rules of international law, such as prohibited intervention. There's been much discussion about this within NATO because your take on sovereignty might impact significantly your willingness to conduct or to be part of specific cyber operations. Similarly, with respect to due diligence, NATO has not made an official statement, at least that I know of. However, state members of NATO have made statements, and you see I have listed there that Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, and Romania have all spoken in favor of an increased duty of due diligence, meaning that states have an obligation to not allow harmful cyber operations from within its territory to impact or to have significant damage on the territory of other states. Canada, the US, and the UK, at least those three, have been a little more hesitant with respect to the principle of due diligence and its application to cyber operations. NATO has made some pretty strong statements about mis, dis, and malinformation. Misinformation being meant to mislead, disinformation being intended to be not true, and malinformation being not true information. Particularly with respect to COVID, NATO and NATO member nations, have made pretty strong statements condemning both state actions and the actions of non-state actors that were intended to mislead the public or to falsify information to the public in NATO nations about the impacts of COVID and about the impacts of government action on COVID. With respect to self-defense, in this case, I'll be speaking mostly of self-defense in its customary nature and as articulated in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Of course, NATO in its charter also adopts a rule on self-defense. That rule is contained in Article 5. And what Article 5 says, Article 5 is a collective self-defense measure that says an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And NATO has specifically embraced the idea that cyber incidents could also lead to an invocation of Article 5. Now, I would note that Article 3 of the same charter requires each member nation to have to build and provide itself and to the organization required and necessary military capabilities. That would, of course, include cyber capabilities. And for those of you who would like to read more detailed analysis on this, I would point you to the 2021 Comprehensive Cyber Defense Policy issued by NATO. It talks about many of these topics at length, something I can't do in the time that I have allotted. In addition to self-defense, here is a statement from NATO. I'll give you a chance to read that. It is pretty clear from all of the recent meetings of ministers that they are taking cyber actions in the same vein as they would take kinetic or other type actions with respect to their importance to the NATO membership. So a cyber activity taken against a member of NATO will draw just as much attention and interest as a kinetic activity. This is demonstrated most recently by alleged Iranian operations against Albania earlier this year, where NATO looked at those as if they were every bit as serious as had they happened in a kinetic way rather than in a cyber way. Here is another area where there might be some gaps in NATO's views. NATO as an organization has not expressed a view on how economic interference might factor into the UN Charter paradigm of armed attack and use of force and prohibited intervention. But at least several nations in NATO, several NATO members have made statements reflecting that some level of economic damage might rise to the level of an armed attack or at least a use of force. Of course, this argument was originally proposed by Brazil when the UN Charter was being performed, was rejected at the time. These nations have now argued that in light of cyber capabilities and how they might impact the running of government, that it might not just be considered a prohibited intervention, but instead might rise to the level of a use of force or an armed attack. Another area where there is some emerging views or some divergence in views is the issue of collective countermeasures. Countermeasures, of course, are otherwise illegal acts that violate international law, but they are taken in response to a previous violation and are deemed to bring the violator back into compliance with international law. Some of the requirements of international law for countermeasures, at least as detailed in the rules on state responsibility, which may come up in a later discussion on this panel, include that usually they are not thought of as being collective and that there must be prior warning given before you can initiate countermeasures. These are two areas where various countries who are members of NATO, though NATO itself has not made a statement, but members of NATO have argued that perhaps giving notice prior to a cyber countermeasure may be inappropriate given the nature of cyber operations. And then other countries have talked about collective countermeasures and have cast doubt on whether the preclusion on collective countermeasures is legitimate in the case of collective cyber countermeasures. That is all the time I have. I would be happy to respond to any questions or comments via email. I would also point you to the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence website. They have a whole host of NATO documents and statements that they have cataloged there in addition to statements of other countries. So if you're looking for more detail on NATO and its statements with respect to cyber operations, I would point you to, again, the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, CCDCOE. And I thank you very much.
We thank Professor Jensen for his excellent presentation on the NATO perspective, which gave us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.